thing that I want to start out with is I have to do this for the record. Okay, this is Sandra Hallam. It is Wednesday, October 30th. And I'm sitting here with Germaine Williams. Germaine, where and when were you born?
I'm born in Kent, Ohio, on Pleasant Avenue in 1923.
Wow. So you were born during the 20s.
Right, 23.
And Pleasant Avenue, why had your parents come to Kent?
They came from Wisconsin. My mother's family was 9 brothers and 2 girls. And my mother was the youngest. And my dad said, if our marriage is going to survive, we have to get out of here, because there's too much family interference. So they moved. He had got a job as an athletic instructor at the YMCA in Akron. And then came the war. They were settled in Akron and had the first baby. And war came, and they wouldn't take him because of the baby. And so he went to work in a tire factory for the war effort and learned to build tires. Well then...
Which tire factory was it?
I don't know whether it was Goodrich or Goodyear, but it was in Akron. It may have been Goodrich because he knew T.G. Graham, and T.G. was with Goodrich. And so then when Mason Tire moved into Kent, then he moved to Kent. And that's how we ended up.
And he worked for Mason Tire?
Mm-hmm. Until they folded, quit, whatever.
It wasn't a very long span that they were.
I have some records of that. It might have been 29 that they collapsed. Because
I was wondering if it had to do with the Depression.
Just before the depths of the Depression, but it was bad. It was very bad.
So you grew up, did you go to the Union School? Which school did you go to?
I went to St. Pat's.
You went to St. Pat's?
Mm-hmm.
Small school.
Got a wonderful education.
And you went there until
8th grade, through 8th grade, and then to Roosevelt.
So you were going to elementary school during the depths of the Depression?
Oh, yes.
What was it like in Kent then?
Well, when we lived on Pleasant Avenue, the buses would come and pick up all the kids on the street, but not the kids from the Catholic school. They were not allowed to go on the buses. But one day my friend talked me into going with her on the bus because they went to DePoyster School, and we were just across the street, you know. So she said, come ride with me. She said, it won't make any difference. So got on the bus, went to school, got off, and when it came time to go back, she came and got me, and we went on the bus. As I was getting off of the bus, the driver said, young lady, don't you do that again. We were not allowed to ride those buses, even though, you know, our parents paid the taxes too,
right.
But because we went to a different school, we weren't allowed to ride the buses. And I can remember many days walking to school and pouring down rain and the bus goes like that. Yeah. Well, but that was just one of the problems.
Was it difficult do you have any memories of how we have heard about people from the railroads, the hobos coming through and homeless people, and in Kent?
Well, even later we moved up to Crane Avenue, and I remember hobos coming to the house. And my dad said that the houses were marked where the people knew they could get a handout. And I can remember a man sitting on the back stoop, my mother giving him sandwich and coffee or something. And one time one of the hobos had sugar and a spoon, and he was drinking it with his spoon in the cup. And I said to my mother, Mother, he's going to knock his eye out. And she said, well, that's his problem. But no, it wasn't. I don't remember too much about it. We had There were 6 of us.
Wow.
And I know on Pleasant Avenue we had a big garden, and Mother canned, and she was a very good baker. And my brothers would play, my older brother would play down around the river. The boys, they had kind of a whoopee club, and at night they would go down and catch fish and turtles and come home and cook them. I can remember the smell of the fish in the house. Not pleasant.
This is from the Cuyahoga,
Yeah, right. Or, see, on Pleasant Avenue, we're just
Which is
right
right.
down the block.
right down the block.
And I remember the old swinging bridge
Oh,
because my brothers, I always wanted to tag along. I was between 2 boys. I always wanted to tag along. So they would get me on that bridge and start swinging it. And of course, if I told Ma, they wouldn't take me anymore. So
now the swinging bridge was attached at around Frank.
it was below, between the Standing Rock and Pleasant Avenue.
Okay, so it was that high up, and it went over.
Went over to the railroad yards because that was a thriving business at that time. And I remember the men walking across with their little lunch pails, back and forth. And had my mother known I was down there with my brother, she would have had a fit because they didn't consider it safe.
Yeah. But it was a pretty, it did swing.
Oh, it was, well, especially if you had 2 boys swinging it from each end. It was not very pleasant.
And then you got to high school,
High school?
and were you transferred then? You went to Roosevelt?
Pardon?
You went to Roosevelt then?
Right, that was, well.
It was
the
open
local
in-
school. Of course, there was the university school too, but that was mostly sons and daughters of the faculty at that time. And then they did take some out-of-town students too, I remember.
Kay Hahn lived right near there, and she went. Kay Hahn,
Oh, yes, I know.
and
Kay.
she went because they lived the next block. And then Brimfield students also were.
Well, I know some from Silver Lake went there too, and it was quite a rivalry, but
The rivalry?
between the 2 schools, of course, Roosevelt was always better. Roosevelt was okay. Those of us who came over from the Catholic school, though, and this is not prejudice, we were leaders in our class. We were well schooled in basics. We didn't have a lot of frills, but we had the basics. And we all did very well. In fact, Margaret, I don't know if you knew Margaret Perkowski. She was a valedictorian. I think they had 2 valedictorians that year. One was Martha Jean Lauderbaugh and Margaret Perkowski. And she was from the Catholic school too.
Was there a feeling that the women the better students would go on to college in any way, or they would?
Well,
It was such a young
they
time.
didn't encourage us to look for scholarships and that kind of thing. And my mother had been a stenographer, and so she sent me or talked me into going to Akron, and I graduated from the Hamill Business School there. So, it was more practical.
Greg, did you learn, what kind of stenography do you remember?
Well, I used the machine, what is it? Stenotype machine. I learned that. And then I learned a lot of accounting and worked with IBM machines. They were early computers and stuff like that.
And then you went to work at the Western Union.
Right. All through school, I had worked in the drugstore. Lee Drug. Did you know Lee Drug?
No. Which one was
It's
Lee?
down on the corner. It was down on the corner of Erie and Water Street.
Oh.
On where Strimples went in. I don't know if they're there now, but there was a business, and that was Lee Drug. And I worked there for a long time. And one of the funny things that happened and Kent was so much smaller then, you know, and everybody knew everybody else. And a cousin of my dad's came to town, and my parents, I guess my parents were okay. But I had visited her in Buffalo, New York. So she came to Kent, and she didn't know our address or anything. So she went into Thompson's drugstore, and she said, "I'm looking for Germaine Adams." And somebody in there said, "Well, she doesn't work here. She works down the street at the drugstore." So I directed her down there. But, you know, and I still to this day get letters addressed Germaine Adams.
Really?
Oh, yeah, every once in a while when I come through. It's amazing.
Did you have a soda fountain at Lee?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely.
Did you work the soda fountain?
Well, some. But most everything. We got bonuses for selling certain items, you know. So if somebody came in asking for aspirin, you didn't pull out Bayer's aspirin. You pulled out a generic brand, you might say. And if we sold that, we got 20% on that sale. So my sales was pretty good. So, but I remember I learned a lot about merchandising, I'll say.
So when did you start to work? When you were 16?
Oh, I remember going down there after school, and then I would work until maybe 10 o'clock at night. And my dad would always come down and walk me home. We didn't have a car at that time. And but he would always meet me and escort me home. None of the boys, my dad.
What, did you ever go, just as a kid, there weren't very many, quote, restaurants then. Did you ever go down to the depot to eat?
No, I didn't, but the Williams talked about that. And that was the highlight of their Sunday. And Marion and Dudley and father and mother would walk down the hill and go to dinner at white tablecloths, a very nice dinner.
In the depot restaurant?
In the depot, right.
We have no pictures
Really?
ever of the inside of the depot restaurant.
And see, I don't remember ever seeing that. I remember taking the train out of the Erie depot. Talked about going to Arizona.
Yes.
And we would get, well, after I was married and we had the children, and Charles said he wanted to take the kids on the train because he went to high school in Arizona.
Oh.
And so he traveled by train a lot. So, let's see, 48, 50, 60s was, then they began to decline, and my daughter was 10. So our children were 10 and 7 and 5, something like that. And we would take, every year, we would take the train to Arizona. And we'd take the Northern Pacific and then another one, and went just, and he would always work it out with the, McNeil was there at that time at the Erie Depot, and we always had luxurious accommodations because we had, worked with the...
How many days, that was quite a trip?
It would usually be 2 full days and 3 nights. And I remember how big Kansas was. Dull and huge and forever. But my kids loved it.
Yeah, they could look out the windows.
We had, I always took their schoolwork with us. And we had certain assignments every day, and they couldn't play until they'd done their assignments. And then they would make up all kinds of games. They had a great time. They had just a wonderful time. And it was a wonderful way to travel.
And you had a sleeper car, obviously, and ate in the dining car.
Right. And I remember one of the trips was probably Northern Pacific, because they were the first with the dome cars.
Yes.
And we had dinner there, up there in the dome car every evening. And you just couldn't think of anything better than that.
Mm.
And we I remember stopping in Utah and seeing the Mormon tabernacle from the train station where we could get out and just look around a little bit. and they put fresh fish on, I don't know what, trout or something, and there was nothing better. So.
Did they
it was
stop the
very-
train actually at that point, or were you just,
They stopped, it
taking
was
on
one of the regular
passengers, right.
stops, and whether people got on or off, I don't know. But I just remember that because we had that wonderful fish there.
so tell me about going to work at the Western Union, because it was getting to be World War II, and you had graduated from high school in what year?
40.
1940, so we were not in the war.
42 I was working Western Union.
Okay.
Trying to think, I did leave Western Union, went to work at the Arsenal.
Oh, in Ravenna.
Mhm.
What was that like?
They were begging for office clerks and that sort of thing. And I was put in charge of the accounting for all of the huts where they stored all the ammunition. So that was very interesting. And it was good, it was interesting, but I remember we carpooled from Kent, and I don't even remember the people I went with, but we would carry our lunch. And
There was
it
no bus that went out to the Arsenal.
No, I don't think so.
I was going to say the
Bus.
trolley didn't go out there, it only went to, wouldn't have gone that far.
Ravenna. No,
Yeah.
no, it didn't go out that far. I was reading an article in the little Kent magazine about Fred Whittlesey, who started the shortstop.
Oh, yes.
And Fred was a friend of mine because when I worked at Western Union, he was just a teenager too, and he worked for a little market that was just down the street, about where Woodsy's is now. And Fred would open it in the morning and get all the stock out, and then he'd go to school, and then he'd come home after school, and he would clean up and do whatever. And we became good friends. We'd both ride our bicycles down to work. One time when I was at the Arsenal, we would go out in the entryway because they had benches and it was nice and sunny and bright, and we'd go out there to eat our lunch. And I was sitting there with somebody, and I heard somebody yell at me, Germaine. And I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Well, a busload of GIs had just driven in, and Fred Whittlesey was on that bus. Of course, I went over, and he was just on a leave, and we made plans to get together. But it was just so weird, that I was at that place at that time, and he was he later married a German girl, brought her back here.
When he was overseas. Wow.
But we were good friends.
Now, did any of your brothers go off to the war? Or were they too young?
Yes, my older brother was, he was drafted, but I don't think he ever went out of this country because he was a very good mechanic.
Oh.
He was a design engineer and he could fix anything. So they put him on the airplanes, and he did that for, I guess, 2 years while he was in. And my younger brother was too young.
And so then in 1941 you went, or 42 you went to Western Union?
I don't remember the year exactly, but while I was at Western Union was a time when Bob Lane was killed, and he was the first casualty from Kent. And we took the tapes and we pasted them onto the telegram, and this one came in stating that he'd been killed. And we had been given instructions about how to handle this, and we had to deliver it personal. We could not just send out a delivery boy with it. We had to deliver it. The manager at that time had to deliver it personally, and I happened to be the manager on that shift. So Amy McConnell and Bob had married just out of high school, and they had a baby. And So I had to take that I had to get a cab, because I didn't have a car, and deliver that telegram to the family.
And you had to stand there.
Stand there and just, what
And
can
they
you
knew
say?
when you came up the door.
Well, they didn't recognize me so much as they would have a soldier, a sailor, or an MP or something of that sort, but of course I knew Amy.
It must have been very, very difficult for a young person.
I always remembered that.
How did it work? Now, you were telling me, when you would come in the morning,
Well, it came in on ticker tape, and it was glued, and you just stick it down, make your lines. Have you ever seen an old telephone?
yes,
Well, and then it just lined it. And so we did a lot of business. We were hooked to Lamb Electric and Twin Coach at that time, and there were several businesses. And so we could take it off and then transcribe it to them, send it right to them directly in the same format. We had two machines, one for receiving, one for sending.
so you could send it to them and they could receive
So
it.
then they would take it off the same as I did.
Okay.
So that's how we did. And the same way with the mill. The mill got, prices always, the market prices, came through our office. And so I was always delivering telegrams up to the office. That's how I met Charles.
I was going to say, I think that the story is that.
Yeah, just happened to see.
Did Charles come down to get the...
We often found excuses to deliver telegrams or pick them up or something.
But you had not known him prior to that?
No.
No.
No, not until that time.
And so, when were you married?
In 1948.
In 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And
Very quiet wedding.
where were you living at that point when you and
I
he
was
went?
living at home, and he was at home. And
Where was his family home?
on Main Street, it's the old Miller Lock house. It's now the Barretts.
That
That
was the
was-
Miller Lock house. That was
Yeah,
the...
he built it.
Oh.
Miller Lock built that house and then sold it to Dudley Williams. And Dudley and the boys lived there. Although I think they bought it about the time Charles went to Arizona to school. So he didn't live there a lot.
And that was right next to the Marvin Kent house.
Well,
So,
the Donaghy house is in between.
yeah. So actually, and Marvin actually sold most of those lots off to people that he knew, so they could
So
build.
Miller,
Yeah, so he probably knew Miller
maybe.
pretty well at that
Yeah,
point.
because there were the lots between that and the Masonic Temple.
So you had a Miller, they had a Miller Lock on
Oh,
it.
definitely. I miss those. We're always hunting for keys. I have one hanging in a bush out here, so my granddaughter can get in if she has to.
No, they were wonderful. I mean, it's a brilliant idea.
Oh, I just couldn't understand. Of course, they ran out of combinations. So I can remember Chuck transferring the little key, the little lock inside to change the lock, transferring that little disc, whatever it was, so you could change the numbers on it. So,
That's the only way you could do it.
yeah.
When you got somebody.
Why that great idea? Of course, it's still on the padlocks. You still get them on the padlocks. And I think there are some companies that make a lock like that inside the handle, so you can manipulate it. But Charles never thought that was safe, so we didn't have it here. So.
That's okay. What about, when you got married, where did you eventually move when you moved in, obviously together? Where was your first home together?
Our first home was on Bryce Road,
Oh, I love
but
that.
at the time we were married, wanted to get married, there was nothing available, no housing at all.
Really?
Because during the war, there was no building. And
Oh.
so, and I said, didn't want to live with relatives, and so we were going to wait until we had a place to live before we got married. And we did, as it turned out. We stayed with his family about 3 months, and they were wonderful people, just wonderful, and it was great. But the Grahams, of course, lived across the street, and they were good friends of the Williams. So one day when Charles was at the house and T.G. Graham came in, he said, "Charles," he said, "I think I have a house for you." And he said, "It's over on Bryce Road, and it's owned by Green, Mr. Green." And he said he's been transferred to Cincinnati or something. And then T.G., of course, was the vice president for Goodrich, and so he knew all these things. And Charles said to him, "Well, how do you know he'll take it?" And T.G. said, "Oh, he's a smart man. He knows the bus doesn't go by that way twice." So, sure enough, then Charles contacted the Greens and bought the house. So
now, which house was it? Because that's a lovely street.
It's,
Is it?
Do you know where the young Myers live now?
Is it on the side where on the same side as the high school, or on the other side?
It's on the other side.
Oh.
It's on the south side. It's where, I think it was Nipano Railroad. Have you ever heard of that?
Nipano.
Okay.
The Nipano, that's how he
Well,
pronounced it, right.
okay. That railroad bed was on that property. That's why it was up on the hill. And something happened, it didn't materialize, and then it was developed. And George Beckwith had a house next to us. They were great friends. And then Vagels lived on the other side, and it was a great place. We had a big backyard. And,
It's a beautiful street, lovely trees.
well, it was all old elms at that time. And then one by one they died, and they were taken down. Except for the one that Mrs. Turner saved. It's on the lot just by Forest Drive. And I think that old elm is still there. And she practically put her arms around it and said, "I dare you to take it down." But they managed to save it, and it was there for a long time after everything else was gone.
Mm.
So it was a lovely street. And we had Lachons were neighbors, and the Yoners were neighbors, and Mastrianis lived on the street for a while.
So what was it like becoming part of the mill, which is one of the oldest, the oldest continuous business in Kent now, but had you known anything about the work there?
No, all I knew was from my work at the telegraph's office. And Charles came home. He was at Brown University, and he had had an accident when he was younger, so he was not able to go into the service. And so he came home and worked in the mill. And he just learned it from the ground up. His father gave him a broom, and said, "That's how you learn the business," and that's what my son did, and that's what my grandson did, And you just get familiar with the plant, which is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was working at the mill. Actually, I don't think he came into the office until after we were married.
Mm.
Oh, I know. He was, his major in college had been chemistry, so they put him in charge of the lab up there, and they do a lot of testing in the lab. And at the time, infestation is always a problem for flour millers. You ever get those little bugs in your house? Mm-hmm. Terrible to get rid of. But he had a machine a miniature milling machine that he ran to get bug count.
Oh, so he would do a test of
Right, and
of a
that
batch.
would be, right, and things like that. And they were constantly testing flour for pH and other things, you know.
Was it his grandfather that started the mill? Charles' grandfather that started the mill?
Yes,
Yeah, that he
Yes.
came in and started, and was the grandfather someone that you had, was he
I
still?
never knew the grandfather.
Okay,
CA, who built this house, and had built the Klein house, which was then sold, let's see, CA sold it to the Davies,
yes.
and that was Governor Davies' house. Everybody calls it the governor's house. But CA, he must have been a marvelous man, because he could sell the product of the mill for 6 months, and then he'd go off to California, take his wife and family and whatever, and go to California or Arizona for the winter. And then he'd come back in the spring, and then he'd sell 6 months again. And
So the mill was closed during the,
no.
Oh, the mill, he just-
they just kept on going. They had a superintendent who ran the mill, and CA would be in touch all the time, but he could just go off. Well, Chuck could never do that. Things changed a lot. Places didn't book. But an interesting thing about the mill, during Charles' reign, the box mixes came out.
Yes.
General Mills started
Yes.
producing box mixes, Pillsbury, and it put the little miller out of business, the little baker. There were a lot of the big bakers. There was a Ward Baking Company in New York, which was a very huge company. They distributed all over the East and Midwest, and they just went bankrupt because a woman could open a box and make her own cake. Why go to a bakery and buy one? So that really hurt all of the mills, and Charles refused to sell to the box mixes. He said that was against his rules.
against his
So
principle?
he had to go out and find other business. Well, he managed one thing. He got into Donut Corporation and began making donut flour,
Oh.
which was a big item in those days. They had a donut machine at the mill. Did you ever see that?
No.
Well, there were times during the years when Charles would have them bring it down and put it on the street during the Kent Fest.
Right. Oh, I
That's
might
right.
have seen it, right.
And somebody would tend it, and it was one of the old-fashioned, you'd flip the donut, and they were just wonderful. But they used it for testing purposes at that point. But he managed to survive. He got a lot of smaller customers. He got into cookie flour, which was a different product entirely, because they had always done cake flour. Cookie flour is just a little different, but
So the difference is made at the mill. He actually is
right.
creating.
They mill to order. It's custom order. The Pepperidge Farms has certain order. Archway cookies, I guess they're defunct now, but they sold a lot to Archway, and they had special kind, So, where was they going with that? Oh, but there were hundreds of small mills like ours in Ohio, and I think maybe 30 survived.
Really?
There's one in southern Ohio that my son still keeps up with. I mean, he has a friend there, but so many of those mills just died, and so then of course that put the farmer in a bind too, because he didn't have any place to put his sell his wheat, and this is a soft wheat it grows specifically in northern Ohio and
Really?
southern Michigan. I think maybe eastern Indiana. You know, it's a very localized type of wheat that grows specifically in this area, and the mill was adapted to that wheat because that's what they could get, and the farmers would
It's interesting.
just bring them in. And people don't understand flour. Different areas like Montana is more pasta flour. Kansas is bread flour. You know, the different types of wheat determine the kind of flour you get. And of course, a lot of the mills mix them. There's a New England mill, King Arthur flour,
Yes.
and they do a lot of, they mix a lot of it. And there were occasions when Charles would do that too. He'd bring in maybe red wheat to get it harder, depending on what the.
So the recipe was what he was told how they wanted it mixed,
Well,
or
they have certain specifications, the pH, I don't know all of the ramifications, but they did have to conform to that, whatever that demanded, because that's, if it went into a bakery and it didn't thicken up the way it was supposed to, they had problems.
he's a baker.
Oh, so you know.
A bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was very interesting.
It's very, I mean, what you're saying is really interesting to me, because I think people have an idea that the mill is the mill. It comes,
Yeah,
the wheat goes in and the white flour comes out. I mean,
So many people don't even realize that they make flour down there.
I know.
They think it's just a granary. And it's all right. But it's a good mill. And
Well, it's such a beautiful, iconic building now, you know.
Well, you know,
besides everything else.
they've had problems because when my son first went into the mill, I remember somebody came to him and said that they were going to make Water Street a one-way street because they had this idea of using the old opera house, converting that area into a shopping area, and traffic would go one way on Water and then go around the other way on DuPuy Street.
What years are we talking about here?
Well, it was before when did the opera house
The opera house
go?
went down in
64 was when
Okay,
the
it was
opera.
before that. Let's see.
He loves the opera house building.
Oh, I did too.
Did you like going? Did you go there?
You know, they often had weddings there. Up on the third floor, they would have big wedding receptions. And when I was younger, I used to sing for weddings at St. Patrick's Church. And oftentimes I would get invited to the weddings then, and we'd have a ball. Some of the Italian weddings, Jewish, or not Jewish, but Polish weddings, they were a lot of fun. And
So they had the wedding reception up there.
yeah, right. The wedding would be at the church, and then they'd all come down to the
So
opera house.
the first floor was where they had the show,
That was a theater.
and the second floor,
I don't know about, I think that
There
there
were
was a
meeting
second.
rooms, I think, on the second
was that the
floor.
IO,
also-
the Oddfellows or something were up there
Yeah,
at one
something,
point?
But on the third floor, they did have these big parties, and they were a lot of fun.
And you saw lots of, there were live shows there and silent, and movies.
Movies,
Yeah.
yes. We'd go to the movies for a nickel, you know, and we'd bring our own popcorn. When we were kids, that was really, Saturdays it was double feature.
Right.
Yeah.
That was really great.
And what years is that? We're talking the 50s?
No,
Well,
she would have been
no,
talking,
it'd be a lot.
She would have been
before
talking
that.
Before that, the
30s.
40s. After the war, though.
30s.
30s.
30s
Oh.
and 40s.
yeah.
It's 23, 33, during the Depression. That was
Right.
That was our fun. So,
And the Opera House was closed for 5 years, at one point from 30 to 35, I found out, and they just they closed it down. I don't know
35.
whether it was,
Well,
of course, what's his name, the Kent Stage was
Shine-
built in.
Yeah, Paul Fee ended up buying that Kent Theater, but that may have been what put the Opera House out, I don't know.
Well, the history tells us the Opera House never was profitable.
It was an awfully big building. Awfully big. And just the upkeep, I can remember the seats getting raggedy and it was pretty shabby, even when I was a kid, so.
That's what we were told,
Mhm.
and,
But I remember those parties on that third floor. They were a lot of fun.
yeah, no, it was a nice, and a shame that there wasn't any way that they could have changed it. But that's an interesting story that they were worried about making Water Street, because then it would ruin your trucking being able to come
Well,
in.
at that point, Pete got very upset, and so he started going to the city council meetings, because that just would have created havoc with the mill. At that time,
Yeah,
you know, they had these big lineups of trucks all over.
I remember even.
But since then, they have put in better equipment so they can unload very quickly, and they don't have that problem. But at that point, it was disaster. So that's how he started getting involved with Kent, because he started going to the council meetings, and then he got involved with Howard and buying up properties and that sort of thing. So, but Sue Palfy, did you know her?
She, someone donated some things, a Palfy, to the,
Well, Sue
about,
Palfy
she just moved out of town or something a few years ago, and she donated to us.
Sue had been a teacher at Roosevelt High School when I was there. And Sue and Mildred Bumford were both teachers at that time.
I was going to ask you
Yeah.
if you had Mildred Bumford, if you
And
knew.
Mildred encouraged me in my singing and taught me a lot. Well, that was great. But Sue Palfy, I remember Chuck telling that she would come to see him to see what they could do to maybe make that a viable entity in the town, if it could contribute in any way, or did he have any ideas? Did he want to buy it? You know, mostly that. And,
Right.
but you know, she was very active for a while, just trying to promote things, and that's where that one-way street developed. From that.
Well, you remember that period of time, and that gets me to, as you went through the 60s, as your children were growing up and leaving, the downtown started to sort of deteriorate. A lot of the stores, some of the stores were moving out, and the food stores, you know, except for Klein's, there weren't too many.
Yeah, it did change. You know, the coteries started, primarily it was ladies got together and they liked to cook. And then it became a meeting for the wives whose husbands were busy downtown. Knifels, Longcoys, and those stores that stayed open on Saturday nights. So they started meeting, and they would just have dinner together, cook and plan dinner together. And that's how it all, that was the pre-coterie group. But then that devolved. Then Emma, I think after her father died, she left the house. And the house was well endowed at the time with railroad stocks and things that just totally went off the charts. And I think there were some electrical stocks. I was chairman of the board at one time and knew all this stuff, but none of those things are viable today. So the coterie members have to support the house now. I don't think there's much income from her legacy.
Never would have imagined that would have gone.
Oh, well, the house, nobody dreamed that there'd be a problem. It was well endowed. So be it.
So what do you remember specifically about the time around 1969 and 70, and then during the May 4th period, how had the change of the town with the university and the town, how did you perceive that going on, particularly around downtown? I mean, the mills down on Water Street, there was a lot of student bars down there and county bars.
It was very bad during that period. Getz Brothers was still in business, and they would constantly knock out his windows. And I don't know if you knew Bluestone, they call him Bluey, Howard Bluestone.
No.
He owned it after the Getzes sold out.
Now, where the Getz Hardware would have been,
It
that
was
was on.
about where Home Savings is now.
Okay.
And so Bluey would sit inside the store and catch some of these kids and take them down to the police station, and by the time he got back, the kids were out on the streets again.
Well,
And
what
it just
years
got to
were
be
they?
very
Well,
frustrating.
when I first
I'd
came
be
to
the
town,
same.
I used to go to the hardware store, it was still here in '69.
Yeah, because it'd be in the 70s that this was going
Yes.
on.
So this was after the shooting that we were
No,
still
this
having
was before.
difficulty?
This was a
Okay.
prelude. It built up, and the town became rather paranoid.
Absolutely.
And the mill especially, they would build fires down in the middle of the street in front of the mill. Well, you know how flammable a mill is. And the police had said, police and fire departments had said, if the mill catches on fire, we
That's it.
evacuate the town.
The whole town.
Because there's nothing we can do.
It'll close.
So, you know, and things like that. And then below the mill there was a Miller Electric. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And a big plate glass window that had been there from the time the mill had been built. And they just stood there and cut it with cutters. They'd form a group, you know, and a couple kids together. Just pointless. You know, what does it have to do with this whole thing?
Was there a sense, was this generally in the evenings, during the weekends when there were a lot of bar activities?
Well,
Was there a sense that it was political or just drunken or vandalism was rampant?
It was political, I think, because what was the big? It wasn't SDS at that time. It was
The
some-
Weather Underground.
The Weather Underground and
Well,
the student and the SDS.
They brought a lot of students in from Akron, and that's what the police would say. You know, there's not a whole lot we can do because kids come in from Akron, and so.
Did you have
it
extra
just
police protection at that point, or what was
Well, they
what was
just-
the feeling on that part of the end of town?
Well, they were. I don't think everybody realized the extent to which this could create havoc. This was so-called playing around downtown like that. But the business owners knew how bad it was, and when they would break into the hardware store and vandalize it, I mean, after all, that's your livelihood. And but I don't think that the general populace had any idea what was going on downtown.
And I certainly can tell you that I'm sure the students had no idea of how volatile the mill going up.
Right.
You know, and I mean, they were innocent in the sense of they didn't understand how dangerous that was.
Right.
I mean, building a bonfire to them was. And of course, Walters, there were a whole group of bars right a block
Yes,
from the mill,
yes,
from
right,
the mill,
right.
which were very active bars for both townies
Yeah.
and students.
Right. And Franklin Avenue still was pretty active. I mean, we still had the Venice and whatever else is down there besides Ray's.
Yeah.
Ray's has always been very reputable.
So that weekend, when actually things did become very explosive on that weekend, was there a sense of, was your son working, who was running the mill then?
No, my son wasn't there. Charles was. Yes.
Charles was there. And what did you feel that weekend? Because it was pretty terrifying.
Well, I think that the downtown owners felt relief that the state was helping them and
That the Guard was
National
coming.
Guard was coming to protect everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they didn't have any idea the way it would turn out.
No.
But and it created a calming influence, I think. But yeah, it was hard. It was a hard time and Charles put long hours in because he just hated to leave the place for fear something would happen.
Right.
And there have been, the Getz block burned. And that, I don't remember when
It was
that
72.
72?
Yeah.
And
That was a frightening fire.
it was very frightening. And of course, they were so afraid that
Sparks.
that it would get to the mill. And they kept spraying the mill down. But that wall, I don't know if you've ever noticed, there's a little alley that goes down. And that wall, I think, must be 2 feet thick. That building, that mill building, is so amazing that it's still standing. Have you ever been inside it?
No. Oh, I would love to go inside.
The shakers go like this constantly.
You can see them through the windows.
Yeah, and
It's
they're
so beautiful.
constantly, and they're bolted to the floor. And the fact that they go around the clock, and that building still is just as good as when it was built.
Mhm.
And what year
So you
was
know.
that building, the original part built?
Oh,
I think it goes back to 1890.
in 1887 maybe.
Yeah, 87, 88.
Around in there. But it's built like the Rock of Gibraltar. But the story is that Charles and he never told me this, but somebody else did, that during the height of the fire, he went up into the elevators to see if, to feel the walls, to see if there were any heat up there, because that's very combustible. And so it was a pretty frightening time. And I remember we lived on Brace Road at the time, and he told me I could not come downtown. So I walked down with the kids, and we were across the street. No, wait, that would be 72?
Yeah, it was in the
Yeah.
we have some
February
film.
of 72.
Dick Myers took
Well,
photographs
there
of it
was
burning.
a big fire down. The
Han building
corner,
died, burned down
the
before.
corner, the Gensimer, the corner.
Yes,
Was
it was a
earlier,
Gensimer fire.
Because I lived on Crane
Right.
End at that time. At that
And then
time,
the
I
Han
remember
building, I
walking
think,
in
was
to
the
see.
year before that, in 71.
Han building
Han.
that was in the other block, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
That
and
was
that
on
one
Water
burned.
Street.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, yeah.
and that was a
So,
terrible, they never rebuilt after
the
that either.
old Gensimer's building, I remember as a child, they had an escalator.
Ooh.
And I can remember my mother taking me down there and going up that escalator. And a big, wide escalator. And it was quite I still can see that in my mind. It was so unusual. And then to have it all just go up in flames.
Mhm.
Bob Meeker talks about working as a young man in Hord's Drugstore in that building
Really?
and the bottom. And he used to make the syrup.
The what?
The syrup for the drinks. He would have to go down and mix up the
Oh, really?
for the he was a soda jerk.
Huh. I thought he worked across the street in the green haberdashery or whatever.
Well, he said during high school he worked at Hord's, and because he
Oh,
remembers
yeah.
the GIs coming in on the train when they would stop and they'd come in and
Right.
get food, and then they'd have like a
Well,
20
that
minutes.
used to be the bus stop too.
Yes, he said.
Because when I was going to school in Akron, I would get the bus there. And the day Roosevelt died, I remember getting on the bus, and this woman was sitting there crying. I sat down beside her and I said, what's the problem? She said, my son's in the service and the president just died and he'll never get home now.
Oh,
That's how they thought of Roosevelt, Majority of people just thought he was the living end. So,
and there was so much war work, related work in Kent too. There was
Well,
a sense of so many of everybody had transferred to making.
Right, yeah. Twin Lakes, I guess, had converted by that time, or Twin Coach had converted.
Yes, Twin Coach was doing.
And,
And then when did you move to this lovely place?
here,
Yeah.
I think it might have been in 84,
Oh.
85. Of course, Chuck's grandfather built it, and he lived here with his wife. He designed the house so that his family would live here, meaning Dudley and his wife and family. And so after Kay and Dudley were married, they did live here for a year, and Charles was born here. But Kay couldn't stand it, you know, two women in one house, no way. No. So Dudley then bought what they called the Cracker Box, which is over on Pearl and Pioneer. And they lived there until they bought the old Miller house. And that's where Charles and Joe were raised. And meantime, C.A. lived here. And he died probably in 36. And this was a working farm. They had fancy cattle. They
Oh,
had
really?
pigs. They had everything. The house down there, that house was on the front of this property, facing off of 43. And C.A. moved it over to the side for a caretaker. And the caretaker lived there and took care of all the livestock. They had cows, horses, pigs, pheasants, I guess just anything you could think of. And it was a good working farm. But the cattle developed undulant fever and had to be destroyed. And that kind of took the wind out of his sails. But then I think about that time he became ill. He died from an aneurysm, which today could have been cured, with antibiotics, but in those days they didn't really have any cure for that. And then Marion had graduated from college and lived here and stayed on with her mother. She did travel some, but for the most part she stayed with her mother and had help. And Mary Williams started into decline. She was a very bright woman. I didn't realize it until I read some manuscripts she'd written, some old things. And she was very well read and very literate. And but I think he was so dominant that she just kind of went into decline after he died. But she and Marion lived here for a long time. Then when she died, Marion stayed on. But Marion would go to Florida in the winter. She would pack up the house. We used to call it shrouded, because everything was covered with a sheet, and the draperies were taken down and covered and stuff. And that was a ritual every fall. And she would come back in April or May and have it unshrouded and open for visitors. And I don't know if I should tell you this story, but I always thought it was kind of funny. Glenn Olds was here, and the Olds became friends of Marion's. I think they met her through church. And so one day, and Charles, my husband, he was a good carpenter, and he liked to fool with things, so he was replacing the windows in the old barn. And so he was down there in his overalls, and he was working, and Glenn Olds came up to him, and he said, "My man, would you know if the lady of the house is at home?" And Charles said, "Well, I think so." He said, "Do you think she'd mind if we call?" And he said, "Go ask her." So, and he said to Charles, and what's your name? And my husband said, "Charles." And so Glenn Olds came up and he introduced himself to Marion. She was very gracious. She invited him in. They became great friends. Do you know he never recognized Charles? I think he was so embarrassed by that. And my husband would just get a big chuckle out of it.
That's a good story.
That's a good story.
But, Charles was just, he was a very modest man. It's just, he just thought that was so funny.
Well, he was wearing overalls, you know. That's,
You know, Glenn Olds wouldn't expect the nephew to be out building a barn. That old barn is interesting too.
it's beautiful.
It was, CA saw it someplace
And moved it?
and moved it.
Ah.
And it's beautiful inside. Right now it's a mess. We have water in the basement and stuff like that. But
How many acres is this?
we have about 55 all in all.
Really?
But it's wooded, you know, clear up.
Yeah.
That used to all be pasture land. And in 36, since 36, it's all grown up. And at first you get just cherry trees, because the birds drop the seeds. And then you begin to get the hardwood, like we started to get the maples, and we're getting some oaks, and we have hickory back there, and tulip trees, and there's some interesting trees, sycamores. That's fun.
So they're mature trees now.
Well, yeah, it just seeded itself through the years.
Isn't that
But
interesting?
it is interesting, and once in a while you come across an old fence or an old salt lick or something like that back in the woods. So I haven't been back for quite a while, but I used to take the kids all the time to walking in the woods. My grandkids, of course, lived here, and they lived in my house more than they did after we moved here. They were here a lot. So it's been a fun place. But it was after Marion died, I really couldn't see living here. All I saw was, it's huge and it's not a very exciting house and all that. And so we dragged our heels and it just sat. Charles would come out and check on things and kept it. And finally he said, we have to make a decision. We're either going to sell it or we're going to move out there. Well, I knew he wanted to because he loved the land, he loved the farm. He gardened out here through the years, you know. And so we got an architect to see what we could do about it and change this end of the house to make it more livable.
This is a beautiful room. You can just stay here all day.
Room, yeah.
You get great sun.
Yeah. Even in the wintertime when the snow falls, it's pretty.
I'll bet.
I'll bet. We had an interesting thing we watched on television last night, and I don't know whether you remember it, but in 1938, do you remember the War of the Worlds
I do.
on the radio?
Very well, and I saw that last night.
Wasn't it?
But you know, so the thing that bothers me is it was an evening broadcast. But I remember I was at somebody's house, we were getting ready to go on a picnic. And this thing, and I thought it was the afternoon, but maybe it was evening. But we heard this thing and said, the world's coming to an end. And I said, well, we better hurry. We will get our picnic in. That's callous youth, you know?
Yeah.
You just...
There wasn't any sense of fear then.
Not really.
Yeah.
No.
The way they described it.
Well, I think we were younger. I was probably teenage. And I remember the occasion, and I remember the boy I was with. But
You were probably interested in the Martians coming, too. It's probably,
well,
I mean, you're curious when you're a kid. You don't take it.
oh yeah. But you know, I don't know. I guess I had the attitude, oh, we're all going to die someday. Why worry about it?
Because that
Too
program,
busy to worry about it.
that program really made it seem like
that,
people on the
yeah.
East Coast were, I think, a lot more frightened.
Yeah, it was really amazing, the repercussions and what it did for Orson Welles. Well, he was quite a man. I think he's way ahead of his time.